Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Welcome back to World War II TV and another show that is coming at you during a week of kind of random discussions, but it could easily have been part of our naval battles show from last week because it does kind of carry on that theme. The show we did with Julia Jones about the volunteers who joined up, early and pre-war. It connects with a little bit about what Nick Hewitt was saying and Nick Stanley was saying, but we're going to go into a deep dive to talk about an individual today. And my guest, Chris O'Flaherty, is a serving Royal Naval officer, and he has decided to write about one of the people that I guess he is finds to be a hero, I suppose is the word. So I'm going to bring him straight in. Folks, just to say, we will be doing questions sort of specific to the details as we go along, and then kind of broad questions right at the end. Just if you are new to World War II TV, I say this every time, but it's very important. Don't forget to click like, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to share what you're doing and leave a comment afterwards. It all helps with that all-important YouTube algorithm to build the channel and allow it to grow. But I'm going to introduce now Chris O'Flaherty. So here we are. So good evening, Chris. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. Delighted to be with you and really looking forward to talking about Derek Wright.
So this is the thing, before we dive into the presentation, your own naval history, when you look back, there are an awful lot of people that you could be writing about. I mean, obviously there are some naval heroes who've had lots of books, Nelson, Koff, for example, but at what point did you discover this story? What made you think this is the guy I want to write about?
Well, this was over a dinner. I was sitting next to the chairman of the Coastal Forces Heritage Trust, and they were in the process of restoring a beautiful motor torpedo boat called MTB 331. And I was asked, would I write a little book or something about MTB 331 to support the restoration? So being a cautious naval officer, I said, go ahead and do a bit of digging. And I found out that MTB 331's actually got only a little bit of history. It was decommissioned fairly early on in the World War II, but I'll talk about that as we go through, and recommissioned around D-Day. But the first commanding officer of MTB 331 was a textbook wartime hero, Derek Jake Wright, Distinguished Service Cross and 2 bars. So I went back to them. I said, I can write you a pamphlet about MTB 331, but I'll write you a book about this hero because he is utterly phenomenal. So that's the origin. And here we are now, published a few weeks ago.
And of course, folks, the link to purchase the book is in the description below. And Chris will explain a little bit later on about where the proceeds go, because this is a fundraiser for a very important cause. And we were just talking before going online, folks, about that. No disrespect to anybody watching. There's a particular type of naval aficionado who is really interested in the engineering aspect, because the size of the vessels that go to sea, from MTBs at one end right up to aircraft carriers, incredible engineering, and there's a real fascination with the developments of armor and speed and navigation and Aztec and torpedoes and all that type of fascinating stuff. But actually, it's about people, isn't it? So do you find that sometimes there are people who have lost a little bit of sight of the fact that these boats and ships have to go out to sea with people on them, and the sea itself, as we know, is can be a very dangerous place. Just forget about an enemy out there waiting for you. So is the human aspect a little bit overlooked, do you think?
It's fascinating looking at what floats different people's boats and what interests them. In the Army, they always say that you equip the man. In the Royal Navy, we say we man the equipment. But the equipment is only as good as the people that are manning it. And if you've got fantastic, heroic, gallant and brave naval officers and ratings who are going to sea in these ships that will do dashing things, then you've got a really good chance to strike hard against the enemy. Where, however, you don't have those people, or you have reluctance, or you don't have that skill and dash and verve, then you can see navies that just aren't quite as effective.
So, well, as usual, you have come armed with a PowerPoint that you are in control of tonight, and we'll take us through this story, which brings us to various locations around the world. It brings in tea, it brings in medals, and it brings in bravery. So over to you. And folks, as I say, if you have questions, then fire away. We've already had one about how many bars can a Distinguished Service Cross have. I guess we'll get into medals later on, but I'm going to hand over to you, and I will jump in with my normal every now and then questions and comments.
I'll talk about bars to the DSC as we go through, actually, because that is quite pertinent for Jake Wright. So I'll talk. It's about 45 minutes. I'll go through some stuff. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to talk through a bit about the man who is my hero for this. I will talk about T, and the reason for that is that Jake Wright's career outside the Navy centered on T. I'll talk a lot about torpedoes and torpedo boats, and specifically the medals that were given to Jake, and also some of his compatriots to recognise their valour, their gallantry, and their bravery. I'll preempt a question because what I found in the past is that some people say, "Okay, great, you've written this great book, but most importantly, what didn't make it?" And I will talk about that because there's some fascinating little vignettes. And then I will round out. We're just talking about the charity because all the proceeds from this do go direct to a charity to support their great work preserving the history of coastal forces. So Jake Wright, he was a wartime hero, absolute hero. 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, plus a mention in dispatches. During World War II, he was involved in 12 enemy engagements in motor torpedo boats. In addition, he conducted 6 mine-laying operations off defended enemy coasts. And to the best of my research, his totals for the war were 7 enemies sunk, plus 1 more probable that I can't quite pin down from my research, either from torpedoes fired by him or from boats under his direct command as senior officer of an MTB flotilla at sea. Bottom line, this guy, he was a leader and he was a tactical maestro, a genuine wartime hero. I mentioned medals, so just to get this up front, what is a Distinguished Service Cross? And the Distinguished Service Cross, it's an operational gallantry award, and it's given now to all ranks, but in World War II, it was only given normally to officers in recognition of exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy at sea. And that's one of the key things. It's at sea and it's gallantry. And the mentioned dispatches, again, which Derek Wright got, mentioned dispatches is an operational gallantry award given to all ranks, and it's always been all ranks, for an act or acts of bravery during active operations. So those are the medals. I'll just qualify that at the beginning so you understand exactly the level that this man was operating at when he was in the face of the enemy. Just looking at the man himself, his family, his father was an advertising representative working for the Sunday Times, but unfortunately he passed away when Derek was just 14 years old. To be exact, it was a month short of Derek's 14th birthday. And at that stage, his maternal grandfather took over his parental supervision. His mum took his father's job as an advertising rep, but his maternal grandfather sent him away to boarding school so that his mum could work and still generate a family income. But to be blunt, Derek hated boarding school. It's a school called Framlingham College in Suffolk, who were actually very helpful with my research. But he left when he was 16 years old. And he left in 1932, just to the back end of the Great Depression. The rest of his family, he had a wonderful wife called Mary, who he met in 1937. Mary, she was known as Molly to all of her friends. She actually worked in the Foreign Office for much of the war. Interestingly, in Section D of the Foreign Office with Philby and Burgess, who, for those that know their history, may recall were working surreptitiously for the Soviet or for the Russians and later for the Soviet Union. Jake, he was a rower. He was a sailor and he was an absolute patriot. He did his apprenticeship in T, working for Brooke Bond from 1932. And then he joined the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve in 1937. It's just as things in Europe started looking a little bit more warlike. The Italians had gone into Abyssinia. Germany was really saber-rattling hard, and he wanted to be ready to do his bit. So having joined up as an ordinary seaman, he progressed through his training, became an able seaman, and was then called up in August 1939. So his call-up papers were issued before war had even been declared. The significance being that he was one of the very first volunteer reserves to be called to arms. During the 6 years of the war and the 7 years that he was serving, he rose from able seaman to commander. And in Royal Navy parlance, that's steam piece. That is an incredible rate of promotion for somebody, even as a reservist, even as a volunteer reservist. And he was finally demobilised in 1946 when he went back to the tea trade. working for Brooke Bond, and I'll talk a little bit more about his life in tea next. But when he retired in 1971, he went back to small boats. And the picture on the right-hand side, the bottom picture, is a beautiful boat called Sea Saga, 36 feet long. I'll talk about it later on in the presentation, because this became one of the real loves of Jake's later life, as they took him and Mary took it on some amazing adventures around France.
Just a quick question for you, Chris, just because it's connecting with what Julia Jones was saying on our show last week, is you talked about his patriotism there. And do you think for him that was the primary reason for volunteering in 37? Because she was saying a lot of the people around that time, or perhaps a bit earlier in the 30s, it was that sense of adventure as well. You get the same types of people who are joining the flying clubs that then became the aces in the Battle of Britain. So would you put it pretty much down to patriotism, or is there also this sense of getting out and doing something in the big wide world?
There was some degree of getting out in the big wide world. He was a member of Twickenham Rowing Club, and he just made their Thames 8 for the Thames Cup, which is the premier amateur rowing competition at Henley Regatta. He'd done that. He wanted to stay fit and healthy, but I was given enormous help in my research with his family, and I've got a lot of evidence from his family papers that actually it was a patriotic fervour that led him to basically cease rowing and take up arms in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. He was supposed to do. They're only supposed to do something like 40 drill nights per year, and in his first 9 months, he did 62.
Wow.
He really went for it because he knew that, I think he knew war was coming, and there's further evidence to support that through the accounts of Brooke Bond, who were already starting to put money aside as a war contingency. So he knew war was coming. So I'm fairly comfortable that a big driver was patriotism in his case.
Cool.
So his life in tea. I mentioned he did his apprenticeship with Brooke Bond, which is the company most people associate with PG Tips. And he trained as a tea taster and a tea buyer. The idea was that he was going to do his apprenticeship with a big company, Brooke Bond, and then he was going to return to his grandfather's business. You remember his grandfather had taken over parental supervision for him. But unfortunately, Grandad Sidney passed away just as Derek finished his indentures. And so he stayed with Brooke Bond. His career was then interrupted by the war. We'll talk more about that next. But he lived in Ceylon then between 1947 and 1961. So on demobilisation, he was sent abroad, and he really helped build the tea business for Brooke Bond out in Ceylon before returning to UK in 61, and was then made the Director of Global Tea Purchasing. And Director of Global Tea Purchasing for a company the size of Brooke Bond is a really big job. Mm. But not only did he work, he also did an awful lot to help the tea business. And one of his big legacies was that he set the conditions through his work on the UN's Tea and Agricultural Committee and the International Standards Organization for ISO 3103 of 1980. Now, I'm sure your viewers are completely familiar with it. And the reason I say that is because ISO 3103 of 1980 is actually how to make the perfect cup of tea. And Jake set the conditions for this, but there's a bit of controversy involved in it.
Well, I was warning folks, you know, there's a lot of people watching this who are going to kind of send in angry letters to World War II TV, and others who will say, finally, about time someone got it right. So I'm just going to state right now, I don't drink tea at all, so I do not have a dog in this fight. So I'm going to sit back and let you say what the perfect cup of tea is. The
perfect cup of tea, you put the milk into the cup before you put the infused tea into the cup. So the milk goes in first, it's just a little bit of milk, little dash, and then you pour the tea out the pot into the cup, and it's not the other way around. For those that are utter aficionados of ISO 3103 of 1980, there are one or two very minor caveats that the document does contain, but the bottom line is the milk goes in to the cup before the tea is poured. Please, that's the controversial bit of tonight's presentation. I needed to get it out of the way. And Derek Wright, he helped set the conditions for that to be published in 1980 through some amazing work he did with various global tea committees. So tea in wartime, and this is something that Derek did follow very heavily. Rationing was introduced for tea in July 1940 because the tea stocks, we'd already gone down for 71,000 tons of tea stock at the beginning of the war, and they were rapidly depleting to a low of about 31,000 tons. And so they had to start rationing. And there were a whole load of committees that were organising this. The Tea Department of the Ministry of Food and the Central Tea Distribution Defence Committee, which had been established in 1938. But one of the big events that was fairly seminal for Jake was on the 29th of June 1942, when the steamship Waiwera was sunk by German torpedoes. She was a 13,000-ton freighter that carried passengers, but she had a lot of food, including 1,000 tons of tea. And the significance of that date will come clear as I go through with one of the big actions that Jake fought. Just to give you some totals, over the course of World War II, 1.2 million tons of tea were consumed in the United Kingdom. But en route to resupply that, 28 tea cargoes were sunk, totaling 33,000 tons, which is only 3%. 3%, though, of an already diminished total, because, of course, everything was being rationed as it was being brought in. And every single cargo of tea was lost to torpedoes. Interesting fact. So a few fun facts about tea in wartime, and the significance of that will come through as I talk about some of the torpedo attacks that Jake was involved with. So the torpedo boats themselves, these boats, and these are the boats that Jake served in for 5 years of the war. They were small, they were nimble, they were light, they were fast, and they were made of wood. Interestingly, my very first ship was also made of wood, HMS Soberton, ton-class minesweeper, but every single one of these was made of wood. A couple of steam gunboats weren't, but the majority of the class were. They were designed for one thing, and that was to attack. Fast and nimble, close, get in, attack the enemy, get back out of there as fast as they can. And when you examine the construction of these, 45% of the internal volume is machinery, 45% is working and living spaces, and 10% of the internal volume is fuel. And that fuel was, in the British case, petrol. And petrol is very volatile, so you have to be very careful of that. And it's something which did become quite a theme of some of the engagements and some of the aftermaths of some of the engagements in which Jake was involved. Torpedo range at the time was around about 4,000 yards, but typically you would close in to about 800 yards before you would fire your torpedoes. And to put that into perspective, that is just longer than a par 5 golf hole. So that is the distance at which you are going to close before you will fire your torpedoes. And remember that the enemy is going to be firing back. So Jake's first torpedo boat, which he commanded, was Motor Torpedo Boat 331. And this is the one I mentioned, which has recently been restored by the Coastal Forces Heritage Trust. She was a 55-foot coastal motorboat by design, 2 main engines. She weighed 17 tons, 550 gallons of petrol, 87 octane petrol. She generated 1,300 horsepower, and speeds vary between 42 knots as a maximum continuous speed up to a burst speed of 46.5 knots, which is about 18 yards per second. These things go really quickly. And MTB 331 was commissioned into the 12th Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla, which was a really odd flotilla because it was designed specifically for some very secret missions. It was formed in October 1941, along with a number of other MTBs, all of the 55-foot class, apart from MTB 345, which is a slightly modified variant. And they took their orders directly from Combined Operations Headquarters, which, for those that are history aficionados, know in October 1941 was taken over by Commodore Mountbatten, later to become Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. And the job that they'd been given was an anti-boom mining operation. So instead of firing torpedoes, those 2 trenches that you may have seen, the troughs at the back of 331, were actually loaded with 4 naval mines. But the mines were set with a 15-minute delay. And the game was get up to the anti-torpedo boom protecting the Scharnhorst, lay the mines next to it, retire to a safe distance, and 15 minutes later the mines would explode and hopefully damage the anti-torpedo boom, therefore allowing other motor torpedo boats to go and torpedo Scharnhorst while she was alongside in Brest. They did most of their training for this in Dartmouth. And if you look at the map, the distance from Dartmouth to the Solent, where they did the torpedo boom trials, and from Dartmouth to Brest, where they were going to do the operation, is almost exactly the same. So there's no coincidence there. But Dartmouth was just that nice little quiet port where they could get on with it. The problem was the laws of physics were against them, and they kept driving up to the Solent from Dartmouth, dropping their mines against a training boom off the Royal Yacht Squadron, but the boom was undamaged because the explosion just goes straight through the rings, and the gas bubble and the shockwave goes through the torpedo net rings and doesn't cause sufficient damage. So they were disbanded in January 1942 without the operation actually taking place. And in fact, Scharnhorst negated it anyway a couple of weeks later when she did the Channel Dash with Prince Eugen and Eisenhower back up to Germany. So, having commanded his first motor torpedo boat, Jake went on to command 5 other motor torpedo boats and 1 motor gunboat. Next 2 commands, MTB 30 and 32, they were Vosper 70-foot class, which to be exact, they were 71 foot and half an inch long. And he also commanded MTB 238, which is a Vosper 72 foot. These boats had about 10 to 13 crew, depending on how many people were available and exactly what their equipment fit was. But now you're looking 2,000 gallons of petrol, 3 engines, 3,500 horsepower. They weigh 40 tons and they can do 40 knots. And these things, again, really designed to attack with 2 torpedo tubes, 21-inch torpedo tubes, a twin half-inch gun, 2 .303 machine guns, and some fantastic people manning it. Because remember, it's, you know, we man the equipment, but you've got people to take these into battle.
Just to interrupt you because I want to. This, when you say about the people, one of the things that my takeaways from Julia Jones last week was where the volunteer reserve officers go and where the regular officers go, because MTBs are a pretty new branch of the Royal Navy. And is there more people going into that area from the volunteer reserve because they're looking for people from outside of the normal way of thinking, or is there a kind of a hierarchy where the new guys go to? What's your take on where people go from sort of 37 and 38?
Well, when Jake finished his officer training in 1940, it was June 1940, he got his commission. His class, they were all offered, where do you want to serve? And some people wanted the grandeur of capital ships. Some of the volunteer reserves he was with wanted to go to the dashing of destroyers. But a lot of them wanted to go to small ships because the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve initially was formed by yachtsmen.
Yeah.
And so if you've grown up in small boats, and Jake, his family owned a small yacht. So if you're used to small boats, why not take that expertise and translated into yachts? And in the early part of the war, one of the stipulations for a commission in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve was a Board of Trade Yacht Masters certificate.
This is what Julia talked about, yeah.
Complete sense to put these people into the smallest boats. Many did go off to other things, to the capital ships, to the grandeur of, or dashing of destroyers, but an awful lot did go to MTBs. And the way the Navy looked at it was that released the regulars, because in the early stages, the MTBs were manned by regulars, but it released the regulars to go back to the big ships where actually they were much more complex and they needed that depth of experience and knowledge of naval matters. Whereas, to be quite frank, a lot of the most torpedo boat flotillas, they were cuffing it. And I'm not exaggerating on that. I've got a lot of evidence that shows that there was no real tactical doctrine in the early stages of the war, because we'd gone down to only 12 most torpedo boats by 1939. And I'll talk very briefly about what happened to those 12 later. All regular manned, but when you've got a massive navy with only 12 motor torpedo boats in which to train the officers to man them, the corporate expertise and the tactical acumen underpinning that was pretty limited. So actually, taking your point, fresh ideas brought in by these yachtsmen turned warriors was brilliant. And actually,
you get all rounders coming in who are pretty good at lots of different things, because navigation, leading, and in an environment like MTB, it's a family more so than on a larger ship, because you're in the same spaces. You've got to be able to deal with people in that working and combat environment. And the interesting thing you said about the doctrine there, because there's been some various conversations about MTBs being primarily used at night rather than daytime. But I'm thinking you're saying is that would have been kind of developed by finding out what works rather than it coming by being an instruction that was laid down in doctrine. It was a go out there and do it and find out how it works best. Does that make sense?
No, completely. And that's one of the things. Jake was a tactical maestro. He made it his business to understand not only his own engagements, but to talk to other people, find out how their engagements had gone. And in 1943, a publication came out called the Coastal Forces Periodical Review, came out about every 2 to 3 months, which then started capturing all of the engagements across the whole of the MTB world. So everyone could start learning properly from everybody else. Until that point, it was almost pub discussions. Yeah. It was boardroom discussions that were helping people to evolve those tactics. And the maneuvers were laid down really, really strictly. But how to use those maneuvers was down to the senior officer at the time, and he had very little to underpin it.
Brilliant stuff. I'll hand it back to you. I'll stop talking.
No problems at all. Well, a good example of one of the actions is 29th of July 1942, when Jake had formed up 4th Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla, which was Jake's flotilla, and the 6th Motor Gunboat Flotilla. And they were ordered to do an offensive patrol off the Dutch coast. So they'd sailed at 2100 on 28th of July. They'd steamed across the southern North Sea at about 25 knots, and they were about 5 miles off the coast of Holland, just off of the Scheldt and Flushing. And they detected an enemy convoy at midnight 37. The plan was, because this was a mixed force of 2 motor torpedo boats and 3 motor gunboats, the motor gunboats sped up and they crossed the bow of the enemy, and they would go up moon to generate diversion and try and draw all the enemy fire. And the motor torpedo boats then quietly go off on the other flank, get themselves into a perfect torpedo firing position, and then they would fire from about 800 yards unseen, whilst the motor gunboats were drawing all the enemy fire. So if you can imagine, that's what's just happened. And Maurice Pryor in MTB 69 had just fired his first weapon, which is quite a loud evolution. And suddenly the enemy realized where the true danger lay. So I'm just going to read what happened next. Jake became the target. Just as he shouted the order to fire port at midnight 43, the bridge of MTB 32, Jake's boat, was hit by an explosive shell. Reggie Walker, his coxswain, was about a foot away from the explosion and slumped forward, falling heavily onto both torpedo firing levers. The distinct putt-putt of the ejection charges informed Jake that both his weapons were now loose, plunging over the bow. With the calmness of an officer wholly in control of his destiny and that of his men, Jake ordered crash start, the direction for Ernest Rowe and his 2 stokers in the engine room to bring all main engines online, now. Almost as if their evasion plan had been heard by the enemy, 2 further shells immediately struck MTB 32, but this time directly into the engine room. A 3rd enemy shell landed with unfortunate precision onto the impulse charge box, the store for the small cartridges used to start the massive petrol powerhouses that were to drive Jake and his team away from the firestorm that erupted upon them. 1 spare starting charge exploded directly into the engine room below. On the opposite flank, and with the timing that choreographers often dream of, Bailey, who was leading the operation, charged forth with his motor gunboats directly back into battle. He had been astern of and unseen by the surrounded Germans, but they had turned back to the north and could now see the entire British force in their gun sights. Closing from the enemy's starboard bow, Bailey and Bossart recommenced firing, but Collins, in motor gunboat 61, had fallen astern. Bossart sent a pithy message, "Are you okay?" To which Collins replied, "No, I'm on fire." With flames now rising visibly from his deck, Collins was drawing about half of the enemy attack. Jake was receiving the rest. And that's the kind of battle these guys were firing. Bailey then crossed the bow of an armed flat trawler, which was defending the central merchantman, and he did what's called a depth charge attack. He signalled it with a single long red flash on his oldest lamp. And Jake had seen this, so Jake consciously stood and took fire in order to allow Bailey a clear run as he crossed the bow of the armed merchantman, a range of about 30 yards. And the way a depth charge attack works is that as the enemy is just driving along, you cross his bow, drop the depth charge, and it rolls underneath to its preset detonation depth, and then just explodes and lifts up the bow like a bucking horse of the enemy and just try to snap him in half. And as that happened, through the flashes of the gunfire, Jake could see not only that bucking horse and that explosion of the depth charge, but he could see the 1,000-ton merchantman rolling over into a terminal capsize. So that is a battle that Jake was involved with on 29th of July. And that was 1 month after the Waiwera, that tea cargo, which Jake had actually read about. I think it was that morning it came in the British press.
Wow. And what, just, sorry, I'm interrupting again.
Yeah.
When it says there, an offensive patrol, what does that mean? I mean, because I know from the ground, the brown jobs, fighting patrols, offensive patrols, reconnaissance patrols. I mean, are they given what they're likely to find out in intelligence and aerial photos, or is it kind of go over there and find out what there is, and it's up to you to carry out whatever you feel is worth doing on the day?
Generally speaking, there were 3 types of missions. One was defensive, which is where a lot of motor torpedo boats, and particularly the motor gunboats, would be sent out to form a screen between the British coastal convoys up the East Coast convoy route and potential German E-boats coming across to attack them. So you just go just to seaward of that. They called them Z-line patrols for various reasons. But that was the defensive patrols. Offensive patrol is where you would go out, you'd go along a known enemy convoy route in the hope of finding something. And then sometimes those patrols were actually intelligence led, where you knew you'd got some kind of intercept. The RAF were actually really good at providing photo imagery of convoys forming up outside of the harbours, quite often by day, because the Germans liked to drive their convoys around at night initially, simply because that was the best way of avoiding the most torpedo boats. Towards the back end of the war, by about late 1943, they actually started moving their convoys by day because they were less afraid of the Air Force than they were of the motor torpedo boats. And MTBs didn't tend to go out by day because they would be attacked by the Luftwaffe. So the Germans actually switched their convoys to by-day convoys for most of the time. They never stopped doing night convoys, and that still gave a lot of opportunities for attack. But the Germans were actually pretty absent for most of the war. It was a real pain because the MTBs wanted to get out there and fight them. But the Germans quite often didn't come out. And you said about the battles and the wars. Let's talk about that later on, because there's a brilliant battle that was never fought. If you remind me of that later.
Right. Okay.
Will do. So talking about torpedo boats again, it was in 1944 that Jake was promoted to lieutenant commander. He'd already established his reputation as an incredibly dashing and gallant officer, and he was made the senior officer of the 58th Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla, which was made of Fairmile Ds, and these were called the dog boats. His first command of a dogboat was MTB 687, and he later went on to command MTB 5008 as well. These were bigger, 115 feet, 115 tons, and 32 knots. So a bit slower, but a lot bigger and a lot more heavily armed. 4 engines, 5,000 horsepower, 5,000 gallons of petrol still, and they had about a 500-mile range. So they could go a lot further in order to harass the enemy. And in terms of armament, normally 2 21-inch torpedo tubes, although some of them had 4 18-inch tubes. 6-pounder gun, and 6-pounder is the weight of the shell, for those that aren't familiar with the terminology. 2.5-inch caliber guns, twin 20mm, twin Vickers machine guns. These really did spout an awful lot of firepower. 9 barrels plus 2 torpedo tubes, so an enormous amount of firepower on these. So to give you an example of an action that happened in his gunboat time, the 58th Flotilla Jakes and the 63rd MTB Flotilla have been sent out. And this was, in fact, an intelligence-led offensive patrol. And Jake was the senior officer and overall command for it. A bit of a shitty night, to be quite frank. It was not good because it was Force 5, sea state 4 to 5, and complete cloud cover. But by that stage, Jake had formed an awful lot of tactical experience about use of radar, which tend to be fitted 1942, 1943 to the MTB flotillas. And he perfected what became known as the slow stalk. So you detect the enemy, you start tracking them, and then you take your time to work your way around them just beyond visual range, which on a night like that is about 1 mile to 1.5 miles. But inside radar range, which is normally about 3 to 4 miles at that stage of radar development, and you could use that extra distance to work your way into the perfect torpedo firing position. And what happened here was Jake spent just over an hour and a quarter working his way into that perfect torpedo firing position. The enemy were maneuvering a little bit. There was suspicion that Jake's forces were being tracked by some more powerful radar ashore, but eventually at 0203, an enemy mistake gave Jake the chance he needed. Jake was up sea, and the enemy maneuvering saw them steady in column a mile on Jake's starboard quarter in near perfect line ahead. Jake signalled to attack. 3 boats would engage one enemy each, with MTBs 684 and 763 concentrating their fire on the larger M-class enemy vessel. As one, the combined 58th and 63rd flotillas instantaneously turned inbound. Jake commenced firing rocket flares over the enemy to silhouette them as he took aim. He had them pinned. An M-class minesweeper, an armed Icelandic trawler, a gun coaster, and a tank landing craft. As the range closed to 3/4 of a mile, the enemy opened fire but failed to manoeuvre. Vertical plumes of water either side of Jake's boat possibly hinted at an explanation. Jake was attacking through an enemy minefield. Independently attacking at ranges of between 900 and 1200 yards, each of Jake's MTBs unloaded their deadly cargo of torpedoes before retiring in the same direction from whence they had come. The attack was a glorious success for Jake. Both of 687's contact torpedoes struck the trawler, sinking her. 769, which had 4 18-inch tubes, achieved 1 hit on the gun coaster, but failed to completely silence it. However, 763 had unleashed all 4 of her 18-inch magnetically fused torpedoes, along with 684's 21-inch contact torpedoes at the M-class minesweeper, which was later seen to disintegrate. And 723 hit the tank landing craft with 2 magnetic torpedoes, silencing it. So a fantastic torpedo attack there. And the significance of the 3 pictures, the top left picture, which is quite faded, you can barely make it out, but that is the original battle report as signed by Jake when he got back that night to Lowestoft. The right-hand one is my sketch of that, which is as I'm trying to research the book and build in my own mind the picture of what was going on. And then if I can give some credit to Declan at Casemate Publishers, who actually took my sketch and made it into something publishable. And that's what appears. And that's a really good illustration of some of the fantastic manoeuvring, which then went on later on in the war, as the tactics we talked about earlier on have been properly developed.
And I have to say, this is I don't know much about this kind of warfare. I'm a ground guy. In my mind, I'm thinking of MTBs as being very much kind of, oh, there's enemy, and just going in at speed and going out again. The fact that they're kind of, and I used in the sidebar, stalking, it's like lions kind of following a herd of wildebeest across the Serengeti or something. They're kind of moving in around, looking at where the weaknesses are, and then when it's ready to strike, moving in en masse. This is not what I really perceive as how they work. So it's just brilliant stuff. I'm learning so much. Thank you so much.
No, delighted. To be honest, what your impression is what would have been happening in 39-40.
Yeah.
By the time you get up to 1944, they'd learned those pack tactics really worked. So what you've identified is exactly right. That impression that probably people had was the reality in the early stages, but watching the evolution is fascinating.
And I know you're going to probably mention this right now, but it's a question that came out from Jack Hunter and I think it's going to come up right now, is how well known in the RN and in the wider world was Jake Wright? Was it kind of a slow burn where his celebrity kind of gradually built up, or was there suddenly like an explosion, like in a Guy Gibson kind of way when suddenly he's over the newspapers?
I would say slow burn. Jake Wright was a relatively private person. He was a fantastic leader and he had a very good reputation, but he didn't shout about himself. There were some of the really big personalities that were out there, the Ken Gemmels, the Hitchins, the Dickens, some of those, they were really out there. But Jake Wright, I mean, the only real celebrity he calls for himself is after an action in 1943. He was interviewed by a guy called Gordon Holman, who wrote a little book which was published during the war in 43. He described personally one of the actions he'd just been through. I think that's really the only celebrity level he ever attained for himself. Even during his career in Tea afterwards, well known to those people that know what he did, but not beyond that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of peer respect within the industry.
Yes.
He's one of the names that's talked about by people who are part of it themselves, but maybe not were known outside of it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Jake had established himself a phenomenal reputation for was bringing his crew back alive. So actually, sailors loved him because sailors wanted to serve with him because he brought his crew back alive. And that, in this world, is a pretty incredible reputation to have and a very valuable one.
Yeah. We've just got a couple of questions I want to pick up from the audience now, just because we should do that now. And the first one from David K is, what is the distinction of silenced versus sunk in terms of ship losses?
That's a phenomenal question, and to be quite frank, I don't know. Silenced is a term that they used to use an awful lot in the battle reports that I read in the Admiralty Library and in the Naval Historical Branch. My interpretation of it is that something was still floating, but basically was utterly disabled. And
whether it cannot fire back, it's lost its offensive.
It's lost. I think it's lost more than just its offensive. It's lost everything.
Lost everything.
But it's still floating. So that's the interpretation. But what I've done is I deliberately used the word silence because that was the word used at the time.
Used in the report, yeah. And the other one from Rob C. Trebor is, how would they coordinate tactics and timing at night? So going back to action there of the moving alongside for an hour, how did they coordinate between the MTBs? What was going on?
The very simple answer is a phenomenal amount of training, and they would train really hard so that not only were you able to maneuver your boat, you also knew it's like a rugby team. If you've trained enough in a rugby team, then you can sometimes just pass the ball knowing one of your compatriots, one of your teammates is going to be where that ball is going to be thrown. And they train so hard to know instinctively what the senior officer was thinking. It's almost like the Nelsonian band of brothers, where you've got so many different tactical plans. But what they quite often did as well was, as soon as you get the enemy, the senior officer would promulgate his attack plan to the other forces by a series of flashing light coded signals. Single long red flash I mentioned earlier on was the signal, I'm attacking with torpedoes. Hotel 5 was attack. Single long flash with red was I'm attacking with depth charges. Hotel 5 attack with torpedoes, although flag 4 also meant attack with torpedoes. And there were certain little signals and codes. But in terms of maneuvering, they used to carry very dim, what they called fighting lights and maneuvering lights. And they used to use that half-quarter light to just watch what the others were doing. And just little flicks on the fighting lights, which was at the very top of the mast, would be enough to send a signal to the other boats. But the problem was they're light. The enemy could see them. And of course, the risk of using light at night is that it diminishes your night vision. And it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to get good night vision. And they relied on that to see each other. To give you an idea of ranges, though, these guys were operating at 30 yards from each other quite often. So they could even shout.
Wow.
I'm not joking. And that was quite good.
And then one more from this little batch, and I'll let you get it back. And it's, did the MTB skippers customize the weaponry on their boats at any point?
Very controversially, yes. They would. The technical answer, of course, would be a categoric no, because there was design control from the Admiralty. The reality was, if you could get hold of a twin 20mm instead of the single barrel you've been provided with, then you would purloin it and fit it. And you just make sure that when the senior admirals were arriving, all the boats would look the same. And then you quickly go back to whichever more offensive weapons you could get. The answer was categorically yes, within the design limits. They also knew you can't put a 6-pounder on a 20mm mounting, because the 6-pounder is just going to crack the deck. So they knew the limits of their boats. But if you could carry an extra couple of gun barrels, then yes, you would try and do it. And there's a lot of innovation that came through. Torpedo sighting is another really good example of innovation, where it's just one of the boats. It's called the McDonald repeater sight, after Lieutenant McDonald, that basically worked out a way of, instead of the captain having the torpedo sight and having to shout orders at the coxswain to drive, they repeated the sight to the coxswain so he could look down it. Why not? But that
And I'm guessing with the comparative small size of these flotillas, that new ideas could spread round pretty quickly. It's not like, when you're talking about a class of ships where they're serving from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean, where a new idea might take months, if not years, to spread around the Royal Navy. In this situation, I suppose, given their proximity, it would be much quicker.
Very much so, definitely, yes.
Super.
And you can see it. And having the reservists there made them just that little bit rogue, which makes it also fascinating to research, to be honest.
Cool. I will shut up and let you get, because I'm interrupting your flow, but we've got lots of great questions coming in, and it's fantastic. So, brilliant stuff.
No, it's lovely. So the medals that he got, the action I described earlier on, 29th of July, 42, he got a DSC for that one. He got his first bar to his DSC for a combination of actions, 16th and 22nd of July plus the 3rd of September. And that led to his bar to his DSC. And then another pair of actions, 3rd and 13th of July, 44 was his second bar. The action I've just described, which was that one of that beautiful coordinated turn, he already had 2 bars to his DSC. And somebody asked the question earlier on, is there a limit? Throughout the Second World War, only one person ever got a DSC with 3 bars. And it became actually quite frowned upon, because it was considered that was almost unseemly or ungainly for somebody to have that many bars. So in Jake's case, he hadn't made the threshold for a DSO, Distinguished Service Order, which was the next higher. So rather oddly, they downgraded him to a mention in dispatches for that fantastic action I've just described under his command. But, dare I say it, a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 bars and a mention in dispatches is a pretty amazing war record. He was one of only 44 people throughout the whole of the World War II to get a DSC with 2 bars.
Wow. So, and as you said, the recognition really being the fact he was renowned for bringing his crews back, because that's really what would matter amongst your fellows, is that medals are great, but medals aren't how you necessarily judge someone's ability. If you're a junior rating of some, you're going to be wanting to go out with someone who'll bring you back home, not necessarily someone who's got, bristling with awards and decorations.
Well, I've got a slide later on, which is the totals for coastal forces in the round, and interestingly, both of the coastal forces VCs were posthumous. So kind of exemplifies your point, I think, Paul. So I said I'd just talk briefly about the French adventure, and this takes us back to the beginning of the war, because in 1939, we were down to basically 12 motor torpedo boats in the Royal Navy. It had just been allowed to completely wane since the end of World War I. And those boats, 3 of them were based in the UK, but the rest were based down in Malta, where they'd been doing basically warm water patrolling off of Malta. And so the order was given for them to return to the UK, where they'd be of an awful lot more use than the first motor torpedo boat flotilla. And the first MTB flotilla looked at the fact that it was November, and the Bay of Biscay in November is not a particularly pleasant place to be. So they decided to come through the French canals. So if you can imagine bringing a flotilla of motor torpedo boats with their 500 horsepower engines through the French canals, this is exactly what they did. And it was a bit of an amazing journey. And when you read the records of it, a very fast journey, some interesting damage they kept causing, because when they went too fast, they grounded the propellers coming through various locks. And the middle picture you can see there is the first motor torpedo boat flotilla transiting through some of the French locks. They're trying to maneuver these quite delicate wooden boats through. But Jake, I mentioned Sea Saga, that beautiful boat he bought in 1971, and he wanted to recreate this. He'd heard all the stories from his RN colleagues during the war of this French adventure as they come up through, through Lyon, through Paris, and their runs ashore there. He wanted to go and see for himself. So beautiful boat, 36 feet long, a flying bridge. It was perfect for him and Molly. And in 1974, they took a little sojourn to Calais just to prove they could get it across the English Channel. And then in 1975, they repeated that down to Calais and then took a long sojourn down through France. They didn't start at Le Havre because the weather to get from Calais to Le Havre was really quite awful, even for June when they tried it. So they actually joined that particular route at Chalon-sur-Saône. My French isn't very good. I apologise for the pronunciation. But they then basically went right down through the south coast of France, and they took Sea Saga to Agde on the French-Spanish border. Just basically went there for their summer holidays every year for years afterwards. In 1987, did the return trip, but a lot slower. I think when Jake and Mary came through, it took them 7 weeks. Whereas if you look at transit days, actually days underway for the first most torpedo boat flotilla, I think they did the entire French canals in about 9 days, plus a little bit of a repair time in Melun in the middle.
Bit more wine on the version in the 80s, I'm guessing.
I think you're probably right. I mentioned that I talk about what didn't make it because sometimes this is, this is kind of the nice little bit of background stuff. The book doesn't go into huge technical detail of the boats. To be quite frank, there's a lot of other really great books that have got the technical detail of the boats. This is more about the people, and it's about Jake Wright, and it's about his personality, his tactical acumen, and the people that helped him generate that. Equally, I don't go into huge amounts of detail of the bases they were operating out of, because in 1945, just after the German surrender, and interestingly, Jake was present at the German MTB surrender in May 45. The Royal Navy decommissioned most of those bases: HMS Beehive, HMS Mantis, HMS Midge, HMS Martello. All those they shut really, really quickly. And because a lot of them were manned by reserve officers, I don't think they'd ever read the Admiralty instruction to send all of your records off to the Naval Historical Branch. So those records never made it back. And it's been fascinating as I'm doing this research to learn of the number of historical societies, particularly along the East Coast and the South Coast, that are now trying to recreate the histories of those wartime bases. Particularly, there's a really good society in Ramsgate. They're doing some phenomenal work to try and understand what was going on out of Ramsgate Harbour. I also abridged the family history. This is about him as a wartime hero, but part of that is that family history, when you look at it, can be a little bit controversial because you uncover some of the dirty laundry, for want of a better phrase. Jake was loyally married to Molly for the best part of 30 years. But whilst they were in Ceylon and Jake was helping build the Brooke Bond business out there, they met a young documentary researcher called Jacqueline Sharratt-Lobwidge. And she'd been sent to Ceylon to research a documentary on tea. And Jake's friendship with Jacqueline actually caused a number of rumours to start circulating around high society in Ceylon. And when I wrote about this, all of 4 of my peer reviewers circled it in red. And Chris, does this really need to be in here? And then they read a few chapters on, because after Mary unfortunately passed away in 1992, 14 months later, Jake married Jacqueline. They all go back to that page. Now I see why it needs to be in here.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, Jacqueline had made a name for herself as an art director in films. And if I said that one of her films was called The Ups and Downs of a Handyman, and another one of her films was called Keeping It Up Downstairs, then you may get the impression of the type of films that she was involved with. The
good old 70s sex comedies with Robin Asquith and all those other people that, yeah. I have no idea what you're talking about, Chris.
Neither have I. This is shocking to me. The other bit of a family thing which came out was Jacqueline, after Jake predeceased Jacqueline, and when they got married, all under English law, your will is automatically annulled on marriage. So they made what's called mirror wills. So both left everything to the other one. But then when the second partner passed away, it was all going to go down to Jake Wright's son and daughter. But Jake predeceased Jacqueline. And just after Jake passed away, Jacqueline changed that mirror will. And this was unbeknown to the family till after she passed away a number of years later. And she actually changed it such that Molly's jewelry and a lot of Jake's treasures from the Second World War that he preserved, and this is what was significant for me, were then left to Jacqueline's housekeeper and not to Jake's family. So it took a bit of work to unpick that. I don't go into huge amounts of detail. The family were amazing in their help for me to understand this, but I say it here because I've got all the evidence, but it's not something that I think should make the official biography necessarily, because it was after Jake's death. And it was interesting because this mirrored something that I found with Guy Hudson, which is another book that I've written, Lieutenant Guy Hudson DSC, when he made his will just before he died. There's a thing you can do called a codicil. So you write your main will, leave everything to your wife. And sometimes people add a codicil to a will a few years later. So instead of rewriting the main document, you just write a short paragraph, leaving a specific gift. And in Guy Hudson's case, another Naval Reserve officer, he left £10,000 to a young lady from Marks and Spencer's. Thing was, he signed the codicil on the same day, in the same pen and with the same witnesses as his main will that left everything to his wife. Could I stop there? So absolutely fascinating when you look at the background of some people's families. Returning to coastal forces, this is the medal total for the coastal forces over World War II. 2,003 medals and mentions in dispatches. And I mentioned 2 VCs, as well as 310 Distinguished Service Crosses and 17 Distinguished Service Orders. And both of those VCs were for the Saint-Nazaire action, and both were posthumous, including one very unusual one, which was Sergeant Durand of the Royal Corps of Engineers, who received his VC for firing off the bow of Motor Launch 306. And the recommendation, the citation, was drafted by an enemy officer.
Yeah, 80 years ago today. And fascinating. Yeah, and I had some criticism for not doing a show about Operation Chariot, but there's only so much you can do in a whip.
There is. Okay, so I've got the mention in there for you, Paul, anyway.
Yeah, perfect.
I said I'd round out with a quick mention of the charity in the museum. Most Torpedo 8331, the bottom 2 pictures, and the bottom left picture is 331 as she's fitting out. The bottom right picture is 331 now she's been restored, and in the National Museum of the Royal Navy and the Explosion Museum at Gosport, where they've done the Night Hunters exhibition. And 331 is exhibited alongside MTB 71, where they've both been restored and displayed. We did manage to get hold of Jake Wright's wartime uniform, and we did manage to get hold of Jake's wartime medals. And they are now on display in that museum, in the Night Hunters exhibition, next to his first command, which Fantastic. Is something that is absolutely amazing. And there's hundreds of other coastal forces exhibits and artifacts in that exhibition as well, which really helped me with my research as well, as we were all getting ready for that and learning about the coastal forces. And the restoration was led in part by the Coastal Forces Heritage Trust, which is a charity founded in 1994 for the advancements of education of matters about coastal forces. They raised £1 million for that Coastal Forces Museum, and the right-hand picture there is 331 in the museum. And their next project is to raise £7 million for a new museum in Hartlepool. And the reason I raise this is because all of the proceeds from Torpedoes team medals go direct to the Coastal Forces Heritage Trust. I'm a salaried naval officer. I don't need the money. This is all for charity. So buying this book is as good as a charity donation direct to the Coastal Forces Heritage Trust. And Casemate did me a really good double digits deal on the royalties, and it just rang straight in there. I've written 3 books. This one, Jerry Kidd very kindly did a forward for, and this is his opinion of the book. Previous young sung naval hero is a genuine delight to read, and he heartily recommends it to anyone who has an interest in naval history of the tea trade, or anyone that just wants to read an amazing tale of an outstanding and inspirational naval warrior. And the money, as I say, goes to charity. Those are my 3 books. All 3 of those, the money goes direct to charity. In the case of Crash Start and Naval Mine Warfare, it goes to the Hudson Trust at Oxford University. In the case of Torpedoes team medals, straight to the Coastal Forces Heritage Trust. And I just ask, please put it out there. Get your friends to buy a copy, because it's a charity donation. Paul, that's my pitch.
It's win-win, isn't it? You know, people get a great book or books if they buy all 3 of them, and you're putting money towards a good project and a cause. So it's win-win. So fantastic stuff. I mean, I've learned a lot, and it's about highlighting a person rather than the technology. Which, you know, when we talked at the beginning, there is a lot of fascination with the kit, and I think you can buy a Haynes manual for an MTB. I think, can't you?
Brilliant book.
But to me. It's the people that make it come alive, because it's the idea of being in command of one of these units and skimming across the waves there and going in there with this deadly armament and taking on an enemy that you're not quite sure what's going to be till you get there. That's what grips me more than how wide is the, what's the draft of the boat and how many millimeters is it between the sail. That doesn't really float my boat, to use a bad pun. But you did say we were going to talk about the battle that was never fought, or did we do that?
No, we talked about that. Basically, this is something which came out as the analysis of the American PT boats. They used to call them PT boats, patrol torpedo boats. And one of the things that happened straight after World War II is the Americans just looked at the stats and said, how many PT boats actually fired their torpedoes? And the answer wasn't as many as they wanted. And how many of those torpedoes actually sank enemy ships? And again, the answer wasn't as many as they wanted. So the Americans very quickly decommissioned their patrol torpedo boat force. Most importantly, without any replacement, without any plan. They just thought this was a useless piece of technology. Right up to the point where about 7 or 8 years later, they were trawling through all of the seized archives from the Japanese. And they came across the fact that the reason the patrol torpedo boats weren't sinking many Japanese is the Japanese were so utterly scared of the PT boats, they never put to sea. The PT boats didn't have to fire their weapons to achieve effect. They just had to be there. And the Japanese modified the majority of their coastal warfighting tactics because of the threat of PT boats. So whilst the PT boat statistics, if you look at torpedoes fired and ships sunk, don't read particularly brilliantly, the effect they had was absolutely incredible. And that's why it's called the battle that was never fought.
Wow.
Because they never went into battle. They didn't need to. They just needed to exist. And they just needed to go to sea and threaten. And the Japanese changed their behavior.
I love those kind of stories. It's like in Normandy, the idea that all the Germans were terrified of typhoons and yabos and dive bombers, but actually the statistics seem to bear out that more German armored vehicles are knocked out by artillery and things like that. But it's a perceived threat can have a huge effect on morale and movement, and whether or not it's an actual threat is just fascinating. This is the era we're in now with nearly 80 years of historiography. We can unravel the what did we think was causing it and what was actually causing these things. And we're in a stage where we've got this data we can look at now and learn things that actually suggest what we thought wasn't quite right. But it's just fascinating stuff to learn about. So, well, brilliant. We will bring things to an end. And I think we've done all the questions that have been going on all times. That's great. So I'm going to remind people what we're coming up tomorrow, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So folks, just 2 more shows before I take my few days off to go and do a tour with James Holland. So tomorrow we are off with the Rifle Brigade into Germany. So Ronald Yelters, who was on last year talking about the Rifle Brigade in Normandy, is picking up the story for the Rifle Brigade's push. That's with 11th Armored Division into Germany. And again, like last time, there's some audio clips of the officer. He's got the memoirs of Don, and I forgot his second name off the top of my head. So some great testimony from a veteran who was there with the Rifle Brigade. And then the next show after that, Mark Turner is joining us for part 3 of our look at US military crimes. So the first 2 shows set up all the kind of the process of understanding it. And the third one is going to be rounding off some of the individual stories of murderers, basically, which kind of follows up from what we were talking about with the Brookwood killers early this week. But right now, again, if you the links are in the description below, but you can contact Chris also via Twitter, and you can find out more information by using those descriptions below. And I say, if there's one book I think you should go out and get this week, it's this one, because it's for a good cause and it's a cracking good read. So there we are. I've made my pitch. I'll bring Chris back in to say good evening, and there we are. You've broken your World War II TV duck. I would like you to come back and expand on either one of the previous 2 books or whatever your next project is. So please consider this an open invitation to come back whenever you want. Did you enjoy talking to our little mob today?
I'll be honest, come back, Paul. I've really enjoyed this, and thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been fantastic, and good luck with the shows the rest of the week. I am going to be definitely engaged and watching, as I often try to do.
Brilliant. Well, there we are then. So this is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying thank you very much for your company today, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye.